Okay. Yeah, so we are already online. It's 7 here, so I think we'll wait 1 minute and very shortly start.
Okay.
And yes, let's wait because we have some first viewers joining us. Okay, it's 7:01. This is 2nd November 2025, and we are meeting live for European DBT Association webinar with Professor Charlie Swenson, who will today speak about No Dead Ends, the magic of dialectics. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you.
So, to whoever does not know Charlie, Charlie is a psychiatrist and psychotherapist who, from his childhood, dreamed about being a basketball player, but it did not work. So, thanks to that, we have a wonderful DBT master, I would say, with more than 30 years expertise in DBT. But what is very important, interesting for us, Charlie was initially trained in psychoanalysis and for many years worked with Professor Otto Kernberg for the psychoanalytic treatment for severe personality disorders, including borderline. And he got expert on that, but it was late 80s, what I remember when you were sharing that you felt this is not enough and you were looking for something else, and that's how you came across Marsha's Linehan work. And from 90s, which is more than 30 years right now, you've been developing DBT first in your in the hospital that you work at New York, right?
That's
And
right.
then you moved to back to Massachusetts. And this Charlie, the last 30 years of Charlie's work is seeing patients and their families for the practice, consulting to DBT therapists and programs, writing, conducting workshop, and teaching people around the world on DBT. And his work is about adapting DBT for inpatient treatment and people with very severe mental health problems in different population, different environment for adults, for adolescents, for family, not only in the theory, but deeply into practice, developing strategies, working on skills on DBT. And he is the author of one of the great DBT book, DBT Principles in Action, Acceptance, Change, and Dialectics. So from Charlie's workshop and seminars, people learn about the core strategies, core principles, and how they rule different aspects of DBT adaptation and work. Charlie, for almost 10 years, been also running great source of DBT knowledge and expertise, which is a podcast to hell and back, which focus on how people struggle and how they can regain their life worth living with DBT skills. And if you go to the podcast on various media, you may have a chance to listen to one of wonderful, famous DBT songs, which we also encourage. Thank you very much, Charlie. And I'm very proud and happy that you are here with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm coming to all of you from the state of New York, where I'm at a hotel. I'm in this lovely conference room all by myself. So I'm picturing all of you in Europe and anywhere else that's listening. And I'm delighted
And
to do it.
we have almost 50 people, so the crowd is really there right
All right,
now.
all right. I can picture the crowd. I've got the crowd in my mind. Having done 120 podcasts where I never see anybody, I'm used to talking to myself. So I'm just going to talk to myself for an hour. And you're free to put questions in the chat and so on. I'm not going to take questions until the end, but we'll have a little bit of time at the end for question and answer. Um, okay, so. This topic today, it's sort of a sexy title I gave this thing, like the magic of dialectics or the dead ends and stuff. But it's really how I think of it by now. And I hope by the end of this talk, you'll understand why I talk in terms of dead ends and magic. Um, but let me start kind of where Magda left off. When I met Marsha Linehan in the late 1980s, looking, I had heard of her model, so I called her. DBT existed only in her laboratory at that point in time. It's unbelievable, given that it's everywhere in the world now. But only that long ago, that's all it was. It was just Marsha and her grad students in Seattle doing this in one laboratory. And I heard about it through a psychiatrist that knew her. And I went out there and I just was really taken by it, even though I had been practicing years with Otto Kernberg and transference focused psychotherapy with borderline personality organization. And so, but I was open to this model because when I heard about it and I saw it, and I had never had anything to do with behaviorism before, I just saw, oh my God, this is adding something different. It's adding skills, which I realized our patients desperately needed, and they got from us sometimes, but not very systematically. And they needed validation, which I think we gave, but we were a little hesitant with validation because we didn't want to, at that moment in time, we didn't want to interfere with the development of the negative transference in therapy. So we were afraid if we did too much validation and too many skills, we were going to miss what we needed to analyze psychoanalytically. So, but it opened my eyes also to see that the way Marsha worked with patients, because I watched hours and hours of videotape, even then, 1988. And I watched these videotapes and I thought, she's a lot more like Otto Kernberg than you might guess. She and Kernberg were both very intense with their patients. They both talked a lot, which is not unusual for a behaviorist, but is very unusual for a psychoanalyst. Kernberg talked a lot with his patients, got very engaged, was very confrontational, could be very empathic. And Marsha had all of the same kind of qualities, but her whole philosophy was different. So I was fascinated. And when I came back to the hospital through an administrator that was one step above me, I was allowed to take over another program and develop it into a DBT program. But now I just want to say, because we're focusing in on dialectics, my view at this point, after a lot of years thinking about dialectics and dialectical strategies and what is that, is that my impression is that Marsha Linehan was way more dialectical than she knew from the beginning, before she even knew the term, or before she applied the term anyway to DBT. She was very dialectical. How do I mean that? She believed very much in her treatment in the 1980s, but she wouldn't publish it until there was research evidence for it, a randomized controlled trial, which first came in 1991. So she had the dialectic between being an absolute believer in what she was doing and at the same time refusing to publish it or put it out there very far until she had evidence that it worked. She was 100% a researcher and she was 100% a clinician. So do not get confused with the concept of dialectics, thinking that it's a 50-50 deal. It's not a 50-50 deal. It's 100% of this, and then it's 100% of the opposition of this. And that's a very important difference between that and 50-50. She was 100% a behaviorist who believed that cognitive behavioral therapies were the answer to behavior change in the world. And she was 100% believer in Zen practice that believed that Zen was the answer to suffering in the world. And she put together a treatment that was able to be 100% behaviorism and 100% mindfulness at the same time. It's quite an accomplishment. Others were trying to do it at the same time in the 1980s and early 1990s. Acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, relapse prevention therapy. It was not her alone doing this, but she had her own special way of doing it. When you worked with her in supervision or in therapy, she was 100% involved in finding solutions. She was a very solution-focused, problem-focused, target-focused therapist. And at the same time, she would shift over and be 100% validation and compassion. Again, she wasn't 50-50. I mean, I can remember well as in supervision with her, which I was in for several years, that she would begin supervision with saying, Charlie, do you want the good news or the bad news about this most recent session? And so I'd say, I'd like the good news first. And she'd be very validating. Charlie, you're a great therapist. You're really validating. You're smart. You come up with good ideas, blah, 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 all of this. Okay, and then she would shift over and I'd say, okay, I'm ready for the bad news. And then she'd say something like, Charlie, do you have a sense of humor? Like, do you never tell a joke? I mean, you're never, ever funny with your patients. And she would grill me about that. And then she'd give me a behavioral assignment. And her assignment at that point, as I remember, in trying to be funnier and being more irreverent in therapy, which I wasn't irreverent enough. I was irreverent in my life, but I think years of psychoanalytic training made me less irreverent in one-on-one therapy. And Marsha said, well, when you go into therapy this week, with every patient in every session, I want you to speak before you think. And that was her formula, behavioral formula for becoming more irreverent. And that still is my behavior. I just actually taught this to a group of therapists in Massachusetts this past week. You know, speak before you think, because so many therapists are very good at being validating, but not so good at being irreverent. So she had all of this. She also, one more very important dialectic about Marsha's presentation is that she knew for a long time, probably 25 years, that if she were to tell her personal story of her own battles in a hospital and her own battles with having borderline personality disorder, her own desire to be dead and to harm herself, she knew that if she told those stories, that it would be comforting and inspiring to many patients around the world. And yet she wouldn't tell that story. Why? Because she also knew equally, another 100% trade-off here. She also knew that if she told that story, there would be important people in the world of psychotherapy and the professions around the world that would trash her, that would quietly dismiss her, that would be stigmatized against her. So she decided, her synthesis was that I will tell my story when my treatment is out in the world and has enough research support to stand on its own legs. It was, you know, I tell these things, it's easy to tell these things now. These are incredible things, the way she handled all of this. So I just wanted to start and say, she didn't start out articulating dialectics at the beginning of developing DBT. I'm going to tell how that happened, but she started out as being very dialectical herself to begin with in her style. I'd say it was kind of in her bones to be dialectical. The next thing I want to say comes from a recent experience. It starts with a recent experience, but it's also, once again, about Marsha. I was doing the third part of an intensive training in Bologna, Italy, a few weeks ago. And one night, as we often do during those things, a bunch of us went out to dinner. There were about 20 people went out to dinner who were at the training. We went to a pizza place, and we were all lined up along a long table, and we were having a very nice time. And as often happens at these things, then I was asked to say a few words. So I stood up and I said a few words. I forget what it was about implementation of DBT in Italy. And there, our waitress was a young woman, all dressed in white. That was her waitress outfit. And she stood there directly opposite me. And at a certain point, she said, she said, "Could I ask you something?" And she was talking to all of us. And someone said, "Yeah." And she said, "I have borderline. And I heard you were using the you said borderline in your talk." The woman spoke a little bit of English, pretty good, actually. And they said, "Well, no," she said, "I have borderline." She said, "Do all of you have borderline?" Which was a cool thing to say to people, DBT therapists, since the original DBT therapists had borderline, you know. Uh, and so I said something like, "Actually, no, we don't all have borderline, but we all have a deep interest in borderline, and we all try to help people with borderline personality disorder, and we're really into that." And she looked like she had just discovered like a treasure chest. She said, "Oh, wow." Like, "Oh, wow, you all know about borderline." And then she started engaging with my colleague Maria Ridolfi right there at the table. And Maria said, "Well, I'll give you my contact information. We could talk about resources in Bologna where you live." And she said, "Oh, I have a psychiatrist and this and that." And there was something, and she stood there with us for a while, and she was very vulnerable. You could tell this is a vulnerable human being who is working her butt off and who is trying to hold herself together, and she's trying to serve us all pizza, and she's asking a very courageous question. And I said to her, I said, "You're a very courageous human being." I said, "I'm sure that that's going to help you get better in having borderline." And she said, "Oh, thank you, thank you." At the end of that dinner, all of us agreed this was just like a complete gift to us. To meet her like that in the middle of the workshop. The next day was the last day of the workshop, and there was a book table, and on the book table was the Italian translation of Marsha Linehan's memoir. And so we bought the memoir, and that night, after everyone else had left, we agreed that I would do this. I went back to the restaurant and I gave her a copy of the memoir, and she was so grateful. What I want to tell you about that story is that what stuck with me about that is that after seeing her, I was thinking about the cover of Marsha Linehan's 1993 manual that all of us have seen, the red and the black book, that has a silhouette of a girl. And that's on the cover. I mean, and that's deliberately on the cover. And the reason I say that is that I think that what drove the development of DBT and all of the technical specifications in that complicated manual, which is a brilliant and complicated manual, what drove that was this silhouette of the girl on the cover, was the Marsha's personal experience of herself and her personal experience of other young women who were in hell, that she was trying to get out of hell. That's what drove everything. And I realized that for most of us that do this work, that's what drives everything. I mean, I know in my own practice of 35 or so years of doing DBT, some of the early people that I met, that I worked with, that I tried to help, I still have the image of them in my mind. And when I'm fighting to try to help people with getting out of hell, one way or another, I'm fighting to get a certain person out of hell and get them to a life worth living. It's that very personal attachment to the idea that somebody could have a life worth living that drives you, that drove Marsha to develop this whole treatment, and that drives so many of us to do it around the world. And so I just wanted to say that I think when you are trying to do anything you can to help other people or to help yourself, you try everything. And so for Marsha Linehan, that meant trying cognitive behavioral therapy because that's what she learned in grad school. And she believed passionately in it. And then she moved on and realized, you know what? I also need to add mindfulness and validation and compassion and awareness and radical acceptance to this package of cognitive behavioral therapy because people are still suffering. And in fact, they find me to be so invalidating when I do cognitive behavioral therapy. So she added that. But then she needed to add more because even though that was a good package, she ran into one dead end after another. She ran into one stuck place after another where treatment was not going anywhere and where there was a fight between patient and therapist and there were crises happening. And she started to add these other therapies, these other approaches, these paradoxical approaches, these approaches that she borrowed from family therapy, like structural family therapy and systemic family therapy, these approaches that she borrowed from martial arts programs like Aikido. And she borrowed various things from like metaphors. And she put all that together as like the next thing. She was just willing to try anything that would work. And so the first set of things that was working was cognitive behavioral therapy, and she never let go of that. And the second things that were working was mindfulness, and she never let go of that. And then the third thing, she didn't know what to call it. And that's where this sort of serendipitous thing came up. And everybody who's studied DBT for very long knows this story, so I don't mean to bore you. But what happened next was so interesting, was that she's having a conversation with her grad students and herself about what to call these other strategies that she's doing, which were rather novel. They weren't CBT per se, though they overlap. They weren't mindfulness per se, but they overlap in Wise Mind. But then her assistant or secretary, whoever it was, someone in her office that was taking notes said, Marsha, you could call it dialectics. And she said, oh, well, what's that? And she said, well, my husband is a professor in the philosophy department here at the University of Washington, and he's a specialist in dialectics. So Marsha got very interested in that. And then she learned that, oh, wow. She brought this guy in. She had a little seminar with her grad students on dialectics, and they discussed it. And she thought about it. She thought, you know what? This is exactly the right term. This is what we're doing. We're doing dialectics. We're combining acceptance strategies and change strategies. We're going all the way to acceptance, radical acceptance, and we're going all the way to change. We're pushing people very hard, and we're putting these together in the same package, and we're going back and forth. And she started to realize that, you know, that it's sort of dialectical in nature to go back and forth between these two opposing positions of therapy and put them together somehow in 50 different ways in the same package. There isn't one way to do dialectics, and that's going to be one of my points as I go along. So she brought dialectics. And so let me catch up with 2 or 3 slides to show you before we go any further, because it kind of is where this story leaves off. Okay, so I want you to look at this slide. For those of you who've done DBT for a long time, this might look a little different than some slides that show the place where dialectics came into DBT. But here's how I think of it at this point. DBT began with a focus on suicidal behavior. So there you have it. It wasn't beginning with borderline. It wasn't beginning with emotion dysregulation. It was beginning with how do we treat people that have repetitive suicidal behaviors of self-harm and suicide attempts. And how did she approach that? Well, you see the circle around that, cognitive behavioral therapy. So we're going to use all the standard equipment of cognitive behavioral therapy to do this. We're going to use behavioral analysis to do sort of idiographic functional analysis of people's behavior. We're going to use cognitive restructuring. We're going to use exposure. We're going to use contingencies. We're going to use skills training. And we're going to do very much cognitive behavioral therapy of suicidal behavior. But then, lo and behold, as I already said, that didn't fully work well enough because people felt so invalidated when you're trying to push them to change when they've had so much suffering in their life already, when they've been invalidated by so many different people in their life already, and they're so sensitive. So she added mindfulness, and I'm depicting that as encircling cognitive behavioral therapy because before dialectics was thought of in the DBT development process, basically you had cognitive behavioral therapy in the context of being mindful. In the context of being compassionate and validating, you do cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's the treatment. And then the story I was just telling you is, but then you need more because you keep getting into stuck places and you need techniques to get out of stuck places. And so then you add dialectics. But notice the way I do it in this particular diagram. Um, Dialectics now is brought in at first, the way I already told you. It was brought in as a way of understanding this sort of fluctuating approach between acceptance strategies and change strategies. But actually, it turns out that it was more than that, because once Marsha Linehan got the idea of what dialectics was, she started to look at the entire treatment through the lens of dialectical principles and what dialectics is. And then what she came up with was that actually dialectics surrounds the entire treatment. And that when you read her, she already knew this in the early 1990s. If you read her book and if you read a couple of articles that she wrote on dialectics, as she says, the whole foundation of DBT is dialectical. So it's kind of like dialectics is the broader ground of the entire treatment within which you do mindfulness and within which you do cognitive behavioral therapy for suicidal behavior, and then, as you know, for a variety of other behavioral problems. And the core concept, as I'm sure most of you know about what dialectics is, I mean, dialectics began to be discussed by Heraclitus, who was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. And then through the last 3,000 years, there have been repeated discussions in philosophy about what it is to be dialectical. And by the way, if you read that stuff, it's very complicated. It isn't like there's this simple formula the way I have on this slide. It's an ongoing conversation with a lot of controversy in it between Heraclitus, and then you get to Plato writing about Socrates' ideas about it, and you get to Aristotle's ideas about it, and you get to Engels' ideas, and you get Marx' ideas, and it goes on and right up to the present. But those are some of the main players, and Hegel. But at the core concept that comes into DBT and that is used in a lot of other fields of inquiry, you have this idea that there is a thesis, a proposition, a truth of some kind, and you have the antithesis or opposing thesis, the opposing force, the opposing truth, and you put them together and you try to maintain both of them. You try to respect both of them. You try to embrace both of them or something important about each of them and arrive somehow at a synthesis. And the synthesis includes the truth from each of the two previous concepts. So this is like a basic core concept that's very important to have in mind as you start thinking about what's the synthesis in this situation. But first of all, what are the opposing forces? And I'll come back to that. But here's what happened. When Linehan started to look at all of DBT through the lens of dialectics, you can see all over the place. Dialectics is all through DBT. It pervades DBT. The biosocial theory is a dialectical theory about the synthesis of what happens when you have a certain kind of biological makeup, especially the brain, but really all the body, and you're in a certain kind of context, a social system, an environment. So it's a biosocial theory is the transaction back and forth between the two, very dialectical. The assumptions in DBT, while I won't go over all of them right now, the typical assumptions about patients in DBT and about therapy in DBT are things like, the patient is doing the best they can, the patient wants to improve, and the patient has to try harder and do better. And throughout the assumptions, those two polarities are there. There are the acceptance-oriented assumptions and the change-oriented assumptions. And so you get these assumptions in your head and you go back and forth. In the agreements of DBT, take, for instance, the consultation team agreements. What's the first one? The dialectical agreement. No one has the absolute truth. That we're going to put the truth together in this consultation team by ongoing dialogue among all of us. Each of us has an angle on the truth, and we're going to try to find synthesis. The primary targets in DBT, even though Linehan doesn't list dialectics as one of the specific targets in stage 1 of treatment or stage 2 of treatment or in pre-treatment, actually, though, when you read her carefully, she says several times that whenever you target anything, at the same time you're targeting non-dialectical thinking, non-dialectical emotions, non-dialectical actions. So you are always targeting, trying to make things more dialectical. The dialectical dilemmas, well, I won't go into them now, of course, but obviously those are give rise to the targets, the secondary targets in DBT that are dialectical in nature. The skills, it's a balance of acceptance skills and change skills. The core strategies, there's 3 core strategies in DBT from Linehan's point of view. One is validation, another is problem solving, and another is dialectical strategies. So that sort of is the fulcrum, the foundation of the strategic approach in DBT is those 3 sets of strategies. In the commitment strategies, those of you who know the commitment strategies, and I won't go through all of them, but the commitment strategies are not simple, how do you get someone to do something by giving an idea or giving a motivation. They almost all are dialectical in nature. They almost all involve movement. For instance, you have the freedom to choose, but there's an absence of alternatives. Those are 2 opposing truths. We're going to work on getting a foot in the door to make small commitments and grow them. And opposite to that, we're going to ask you for the moon. We're going to ask you for a huge commitment. So foot in the door and door in the face is another dialectical strategy. Doing the pros and cons of making a commitment. Here's the good news about making a commitment. Here's the bad news about making a commitment. All of these things are interestingly dialectical strategies. You're trying to help a person find the synthesis of the 2 positions. Communication styles. You have the reciprocal communication style where you're warm and sensitive and genuine and even share some things from yourself. And then you have the irreverent style where you're pushy and confrontational and sometimes sort of out of the box. Case management strategies, you're trying to consult to the client to manage their own life, but now and then under certain circumstances, you bring in environmental strategies where you're trying to give aid to the patient's environment, try actually intervene in the environment. And I could go on because when you look through almost all of DBT, it's cast through the lens of dialectics. Okay. The next point, let me just see what I want to make to you. Let me give you a brief go to a case example right now, or a couple of them to capture, because this has all been kind of theoretical so far. So let me just say, last week, I was running an intensive, part 2 of an intensive in Massachusetts, because we have a sort of a top-down decision in Massachusetts to implement DBT throughout every state hospital in Massachusetts, which is a huge number of hospitals affecting about 600 patients. And the decision was made in the state to implement DBT throughout the state hospital system. So we're training people in the state hospital system. So this last week, when I was doing an intensive, at one point, I said, let's talk about the actual patients you guys are working with. And, these are devastating cases of people who've had terrible situations. And many of you, I'm sure, know what I'm talking about. And so I said, okay, let's just do role plays for a while. You come up and you play your most impossible patient, and I'll be the therapist. And let's see what happens. And of course, what happened with every one of them was I ended up being dialectical because I couldn't just do cognitive behavioral strategies straight. I couldn't just name a problem behavior and say, okay, let's come up with a solution. Then somebody would, might actually hit me. I might actually say, if I keep talking, they're going to start a fire, or they're going to beat someone up, or they're going to kill themselves. And then I'd get validating and compassionate, and nothing would get better. So then you're stuck. You're in a dead end. You're in a trap. You're like in a chamber, and you can't get out. And you start to feel rather isolated, even in 5 minutes of such a dialogue. And I'll just give one case example. There was one woman that came up and she played a patient of hers. That patient desperately wanted to get out of the hospital where she had been for several years already and wanted to go have her own apartment in a certain city in Massachusetts that was her favorite city. And the problem was that she didn't have any money and she didn't have any public assistance that would help her with the apartment because she kept being rejected when she would apply for public assistance. And she didn't know why. And she was very angry about that. And the team in the hospital wanted her to go to a group home, said that would be, we can give you a group home. You can go there and that'll give you some assistance. And then you can work towards an apartment. She said, absolutely not. I will not go to a group home. And over my dead body will I go to a group home. I will not go live with a bunch of mentally ill people, which is so interesting since she lives in the middle of a state hospital. But she said, I'm not leaving this place until I'm allowed to go to an apartment of my own. And she was really pissed about it. And she's ready to kill herself. And she had already been violent on the unit and several times had to be in restraints. And she said, I will do that again. If I can't get what I want, I will be violent. So it was really a tough thing. I was like, I was only 5 or 10 minutes into this dialogue, and already we were stuck. We were in hell. We were in hell. Just want to remind you, those of you, or maybe inform you, those of you who haven't been trained that much yet in DBT. The Marsha Linehan's definition of how you help people in DBT is you have to get into hell with the patient, and then with the patient, the two of you get out. And I felt in 10 minutes, I was already in hell with a role play of a patient. I wasn't even the therapist. These therapists are working there year after year, slugging away with great passion about trying to help them. And so what did I do? Well, I spent part of my interview validating her about how desperately she wants to be in her own apartment. I got a picture of what her apartment would be like, that she would have a cat, that she would have flowers there, that she would have a little yard, she would have all these things, and it would make her life worthwhile. I thought, that's the dream of making your life worthwhile, right? And I just validated that. I listened to that. I said, this is so fantastic. I love that you have that image in your mind. That's the image that's going to pull you out of hell, and it's going to get you there. You're eventually going to get there one way or another. And then she would sort of shoot me down. I'd try to be validating, and she'd say, yeah, but nobody's helping me do that right now. So then I sort of validated her for a while about the fact that she didn't want to be in a group home. I told her, actually, my very first job in mental health ever, and it was true. When I was in medical school, I was the co-director of a group home that had 16 mentally ill people in New Haven, Connecticut, and running this. And I said, I know what it's like to be in a group home. I've helped develop group homes. You're right. A lot of mentally ill people are in group homes. A lot of tough things happen in group homes. Yeah, you're totally right. That's no wonder you don't want to go there. Validated that for a while. Then I validated that she wanted to stay in the state hospital rather than go somewhere else. Said, there's something very sort of comforting about you being here in the state hospital. And I validated that. So what am I doing? I'm validating all of these opposing positions. I also now and then am suggesting that there don't seem to be any other options, but I'm validating it. And by the time we get to the end of this conversation, we have not come to what you would call a synthesis. So I want to make a point about this. When you're trying to do dialectics, you don't necessarily arrive at a synthesis. You don't necessarily get to the place that you say, oh man, we got it. We've just merged the opposites and now we've got the synthesis and now it's going to work. Sometimes that happens, but sometimes it's more important to grasp that the process of being dialectical in some ways is more important than the outcome. Because what this woman told me and what she told the group, I said, was that helpful to you? Since we didn't find a solution. And she said, it was so helpful because I realized that just the fact that you kept talking like you're validating this, you're validating that, you're looking at both sides, you're talking about different options, you're brainstorming, you're going through it with me, you're distressed yourself. She said, I realized, I felt like I was in it with you. I felt like I was in it with you. And I don't think my patient feels that. I think my patient feels like I'm trying to push her to something. And so I said, exactly. But dialectics, it doesn't just mean you get to a synthesis together. You're on your way to a synthesis. You have the idea of a synthesis. It's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that keeps you moving forward. It's motivating. And you keep going there. And that process helps you to discover a synthesis. You can't force a synthesis. You can't build a synthesis. A synthesis, this is what the magic of dialectics is that a synthesis happens. You set the stage for it, and then it happens. It's not something you're in charge of. You're in charge of setting the conditions for a synthesis, and I'm going to talk about what those are. I want to tell you briefly one other case example that's in a way, it's much more elegant than what I did. And it actually came to a synthesis. So I want you to have another good example in mind before I go forward and tell you what I think the principles are of building toward a dialectical synthesis. And that is the following. And some of you may have known of this if you've been taught by me before, or if it's probably in my book. But if it's in my book, you never know what's in somebody's book because you have to disguise every case. So I don't even know if I did write this case in the book, it might not sound like it. So here's it. There's this DBT therapist that actually was with Marsha Linehan at the very, very, very beginning. He's a psychologist named Ed Sheeran. Some of you might know Ed. He's in the Washington, D.C. area. And Ed I had the good fortune when I was developing my inpatient program that Ed came and moved there and he became a psychologist on my program. And he's very gentlemanly, sweet, smart, incredible consultant in DBT. But, he's kind of definite. He's like the polar opposite of Marsha Linehan's style. He's like just very gentle, very, he's not hitting anyone over the head, but boy, was he smart. And so here's what happened. He had a 19-year-old patient on my inpatient ward. And she came there because she kept trying to kill herself. And then she was harming herself. And then she's on my inpatient ward. And then one day she says to Ed Sheeran, Ed, I'm leaving this place. And he says, I'm sorry, you can't, I want to help you leave. Let's get you out of here as soon as you can, but you can't leave today. Well, I mean today, I've got to leave. I'm ready to go. I'm done. I've got everything I can get out of this place. And I'm really tired of you people. And so I'm done. And he says, well, it's really difficult to discharge you right now because actually you harmed yourself this morning. And so we're not quite ready to discharge you yet, but let's you and I get to work on that so you can get out of here soon, but get out of here safely. And she says, I am safe. I cut myself this morning just to prove to myself that I could have my last time cutting myself, and now I'm done and it's over. So I'm ready to move on. How do I get out? He said, well, the one thing you could do is you can file a paper. There's a paper that we call a 72-hour notice. And if you sign the 72-hour notice, there will be a court hearing within 72 hours. There has to be. And the judge will decide whether you get out. And he'll hear from you and he'll hear from the hospital. And the judge will decide. So if you want to do that, you could do that. She said, I want to do that right now. Where do I do that? Go to the nursing station and get a piece of paper. Just tell them you need a 72-hour notice and then sign it right away. And look at what time it is. Within 72 hours, you'll have a hearing. I'm doing it. So here was the magic of dialectics. I don't know how Ed came up with this. I have never forgotten this intervention. It's been like 30 some years. But interventions like this it was like a brilliant thing where everything came together in his head. He didn't even have time to do the steps of being dialectical. He just did it all at once. And what he said was, and you know, as soon as you fill out that paper, let's you and me have an extra session today. Let's have a session right away. Why? We don't need any sessions if I'm leaving. He said, no, you absolutely need a session if you're leaving. Well, why do I need a session? Because I need to teach you the skills so that you can skillfully present before the judge. If you're going to present your case, you're going to need skills. This is not easy. And she said, oh, you're telling me that you want to give me skills to argue against the hospital to get out. And he said, exactly. Why would you do that? He said, because, you know, all I care about is that you get skillful. It moves me again when I think of that. All that is the synthesis. The synthesis is that I'm going to teach you skills, whatever you're going to do. If skills to defeat us, skills to get where you go, whatever it is, our job here is to make you more skillful. And then Ed said one more thing. He said, and by the way, when you do go to the judge and argue your case, the person who will be arguing the case against you is me. And I'm really good at this. I've been doing this for a long time. So I want you to be skillful. And she was like thrown off guard. She was confused, which is often the case after dialectical interventions. That is a brilliant, I want you to remember that intervention. There's a lot in that intervention that happened in a matter of 30 seconds somehow in Ed Sheeran's mind and intervention, but it really captures the basic idea of why it's so skillful. Now, let me move on. I just wanted to get you a couple of examples to have in your head as we go forward. Okay, next slide. So here's the thing. A little personal account of my years as a DBT therapist trying to use dialectical strategies. It took me a long time to realize that when you try to use dialectical strategies, there are 9 dialectical strategies that Marsha Linehan named that are in her manual. And if you get stuck in treatment, you say, oh, I should use one of the 9 strategies. Which one should I use? You say, God, could I come up with a metaphor for this situation? Or can I come up with another strategy as making lemonade out of lemons, kind of find the silver lining in this situation? Could I use one of the unusual ones like extending or something? And by the time you actually even think about the one you want to use, the moment is now different. And the moment has passed sometimes. And so there's something very wonderful about these 9 strategies, and there's something very confining about these 9 strategies. If you think that your job in life at that moment, when things are stuck and you're in a dead end with your patient, you think you should apply one of these 9 strategies or 3 of these 9 strategies. I think that these strategies are incredibly helpful, but that's not the way to get to them. The way to get to them is actually that, because it's just not very user-friendly when you're in an emotionally dysregulated relationship at that moment and you're trying to come up with something like that. It's like you're blind when you're just trying to stick a strategy into the add it on. So what you want to do is become dialectical, which is different than do a dialectical strategy. You want to enter into a dialectical frame of mind. You want to enter into a dialectical way of being with your patient. And after I go over 4 sets of principles about that, I'm going to go over what is a 6-step process that I use in my mind to bring dialectics into a conversation with the patient. But first, let's go over what the view of the world view of being dialectical. And this you can gather from Marsha's work. You can gather this actually from going back to some of the people that I mentioned before that are in the history of philosophy of dialectics, is that these are very well established ideas that are kind of like the undergird, the underpinnings of what it is to be dialectical. Like, what's the basic foundation of being dialectical? There are these 4 things. There's a slide for each of them, but just to go over them, there's what's called the unity of opposites, which I've already talked about a fair amount, but we're going to come back to. There's the constancy of movement. There's a certain assumption about how things never stop. There's systemic thinking and transactional process, which has to do with understanding how everything is related to everything else. And then there's another view, which is more me writing this in, which is, I say, dead ends are illusions. That's an assumption. I make an assumption that really helps me when I'm in a dead end, which is it's not a dead end. It's not a dead end. This just pops to mind right now. It doesn't help you in treatment, but just to get you the idea that the dead ends idea came to me in that I used to do DBT training with a dear, dear friend who was, I think, a brilliant DBT trainer named Cindy Sanderson. And she died of breast cancer in 2003. But we were best friends for many years before that, and we did a lot of teaching together. And I found that when she died, after 11 years of battling breast cancer, I felt it was a terrible, sad ending because she and I had a lot of dreams of what we wanted to do together. But what I found afterwards was actually my relationship with her went on. She was dead, but I continued to communicate with her, about her. My ideas developed about her. My plans developed that I was going to do with her, affected by plans without her. I had internalized her, and actually it was not a dead end. So even death, I realized, is not a dead end. And of course, I'm taken to certain Buddhist teachings that are very similar to that idea. So let's look at these different, I'm going to try to give like a case example of each of these sets of principles. So first is the unity of opposites. So I'll just read this first and then I'll give you an example. So reality is a dynamic interplay of opposing forces and concepts. The idea here is that actually this is how all of reality is composed, is that every time you do something, there's an opposite, you elicit an opposite force. So a truth elicits its opposite, just automatically. It's the way the world works. An action elicits an opposite reaction. If you're in a big room with a lot of people and you say, my God, it's cold in here, there's no doubt in my mind somebody in that room is thinking or might even say, actually, I find it pretty hot. If you're in a group of people, someone says, you know, I think we should have a leader in this group. It helps to have a leader. And someone else will say, I'm sick of having leaders in groups. Leaders really bring groups down. I think we should have a leader in this group. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. And non-acceptance of opposition, in that opposition is natural, opposition happens all the time. If you suggest something to your patient, you should expect that your patient either will say to you or be thinking, I don't want to do that. I disagree with that. I don't want that. And that's actually reality. And if you don't accept opposition as a natural force in the world, then you end up with rigid positions. You end up in tension with the world or with yourself, and you end up often with dysregulation. But if you accept the presence of opposition, if you lean into opposition, if you have a patient that opposes you about something, if you could just say to yourself, of course they oppose me. That's the nature of the universe. And that's the nature of our relationship. And of course that happened. If you can just accept the presence of opposition and still be bold and still push and still pull and still validate and still do all of that, that's going to facilitate synthesis over time. A little metaphor about this. When the tunnel narrows and there are only two choices left, which some of our patients get to, here's my choice. I can continue to live and suffer, or I can die and get release of suffering. That's often what our patients get down to before they kill themselves, is that those are their only two choices. They cannot find a third choice. And so treatment becomes an effort to find a third option. That has guided me in so many cases and so many situations when seems like there's only two choices and they're opposed to each other and neither one gets you is a full answer, then look for a third option. And remember that you can create conditions for synthesis, but you can't force it. I mentioned that once before. I guess I mentioned it twice now because I've done supervision for many years of DBT, of teams and individual therapists. And it's very common for people, especially when they're talking teams, thinking the team should come up with the synthesis. And I just think that's a wrong-headed way of thinking about synthesis. You can't make a synthesis happen. So here's an example from an inpatient setting, from a suicidal patient. There was a suicidal patient in my inpatient DBT hospital program in New York. And she was about 21. She came from New York City. She grew up there in a relatively prominent family, actually. And she wanted to die. She desperately wanted to die. All she could talk about was how much she wanted to die. And she had a psychology postdoctoral fellow, somebody who came to learn to do therapy with borderline patients on our unit and was under supervision, and who came up with this, again, another brilliant intervention that was very dialectical and came out with the synthesis. Because she was talking to her patient one day who then said to her, I just want to die. That's all I want to do. So the therapist said, so tell me about dying. What does that do for you? She said, that's the only way out. That's the only way out of the suffering that I'm in. I have two choices in life. I can either continue to live and I'll just suffer terribly my whole life, or I could die. And obviously that's more appealing sounding to me. And this therapist was had a very clever dialectical response. It isn't captured by any one of the strategies, except you could say she was using a kind of metaphor. Because she said, you know what, she said to the patient, so you have a kind of life-threatening condition. And like kids in our society that have cancer and it might end their lives. Have you ever heard of what's called the Make-A-Wish Foundation? The patient said, yeah, I've heard of that. She said, right, where kids are given one wish before they die that they would like to fulfill, and then the foundation tries to make it happen. Yeah, I understand that. The patients, so the therapist said, so if we consider this a life-threatening situation you have, and if you had one wish, to get one more thing to do before you die, before you take your life, what would it be? Patient thought for a moment, and then she said, I think if I had one wish, I would run in the New York City Marathon. Really? Have you ever run? No, I've never been a runner. But all my life, I've gone to the New York City Marathon every fall, and I watch the race and I watch people run by and I watch people run to Central Park. And it's like, I just think it's the coolest thing ever that people do that. I've never been able to run myself, but I would love to do that before I die. Yeah, that would be it. So the therapist in response to that says, okay, in our before for our next session, bring your tennis shoes. Okay. Patient brought her tennis shoes. Patient and the therapist went out running. They could barely run. The therapist could run, but the patient couldn't run much. But they jogged a little bit and they walked a little bit and they jogged a little bit and they walked a little bit and did therapy. And then they did it again. And then within about 2 weeks, the therapist assigned the patient with one of the recreational therapists in the hospital to go out regularly running. And she agreed to do that. Long story short, I ran into this patient maybe 1 or 2 years later in New York, just by accident. And I said, at first I thought, oh God, she's still alive. And then I said, how have things been going? Well, okay, I'm doing this and I'm doing this. I forget what she said. And I said, when I last knew you, you wanted to die and you were thinking about the New York City Marathon. Whatever happened with that? She said, I actually ran it. I ran it really slow, but I ran it many, many months later and I had to work up to it. I said, and what a difference did that make to you? She said, well, when you do that, I just encountered other people and I ran next to other people and I had a lot of conversations and I did other things. And I don't know, it just started to feel like I found reasons to keep living. So to me, that's a good example of the unity of opposites, that her therapist validated her desire to die and validated the suffering that she was living and validated her suffering, and then came up with a third option, which has actually worked. So I just wanted to give an example. Next one. Another principle would be what I'll call the constancy of movement. Every element in the universe is in constant motion, every element at every level. Everything's moving. The perception of stagnation is an illusion. A situation might seem stuck and stagnant, but movement never stops. This is an assumption that I make when I'm working with people where it seems like everything has come to a stop. And the patient's main answer to every question you ask is, it's the same old, same old. It's the same old suffering. It's the same old depression. It's the same old anxiety. It's the same old wish to die. And so you realize that you hear that, but if where your mind goes is, you know what? I know things are changing every moment. I know every molecule, every atom, every subparticle in her brain, in my brain, in the context around us, everything is changing. When I see her, it's never, ever the same, even though it looks the same, it feels the same, but it isn't the same. So that gives hope. That gives motivation. That gives momentum to keep going, even in the face of what doesn't appear to be any obvious reinforcement for all of your effort. And it helps you feel hope, even though there's a sort of a feeling of hopelessness there. And to embrace dialectics, and Linehan made a big point of this in her strategies, is to embrace speed, movement, and flow, or movement, speed, and flow. She sometimes wrote about it. But she really felt like not only is there constant movement going on, even if you stand still, there's constant movement going on, but as psychotherapy with DBT, you should keep moving. You should try this. You should try that. You should try another thing. You should look for a different cause. You should look for a different problem. You should change the nature of the treatment. You should get consultation. You just keep going. You just keep going. You just keep going, because you embrace the idea that movement keeps happening and you don't just settle down into stagnation and let everything fall apart. I want to give an example of this. Here's a non-clinical example. It's my favorite example of this. As somebody who, as Magda, when she introduced me, said, I wished I was a basketball player. That is true. I grew up for most of the first 15 years of my life. That's what I wanted to be. But I didn't have that level of physical talent. But I've always been a fan of basketball. So, of course, if you're a fan of basketball, you know something about Michael Jordan. And Michael Jordan was being interviewed a few years ago after he had quit playing basketball. And the interviewer had asked him this great question, which was, Michael, of everything you did when you played basketball, what was your favorite? And you could just see that he liked this question. And I was watching the interview, and he said, well, here's what I liked best. It's the playoffs. There's only about 20 seconds left in the game. The game is tied. It's a very important game. We have the ball, and we have the ball out of bounds. And everybody there on the other team, and everybody there watching, and everyone on television who's watching, everyone in the world who watches this knows the ball is coming to me. And so I know the ball's coming to me, and I have 20 seconds. And I stand there and I look up at the basket and I think, okay, that's where I have to get to. I have to get to that basket. That is my goal. I have to make a basket. And then I get the ball. But I don't know what I'm going to do. He said, it's very important that I don't know what I'm going to do. Because if I do know what I'm going to do, it's probably not going to work. But if I don't know what I'm going to do, nobody knows what I'm going to do. And so I get the ball and I just start moving. And I just move and I move. And then I move this way and I move that way. And I try this and I try that. And I work my way towards the basket. And the majority of the time, I will score. He says, and when I'm doing it, the best moment I ever get when I play is I see myself doing something that I've never done before. I do something I've never done. I make a move that I've never made before. That's the best moment of playing basketball. And I thought, that's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is as a therapist. You're completely stuck. You know what the goal is. The goal is your target. The goal is getting through this dead end, getting through this terrible moment, getting a skill, getting someone to use a skill, getting someone to not kill themselves at that point, getting someone to fight for a life worth living, whatever it is. Like, that's what you have your eye on. And if you think you have a scripted way to get there, there's a good chance it will not work. So you have to have a lot of possibilities. You have to have mastered some fundamentals, and then you start moving towards the target, and you never know what's going to happen next. And it's that not knowing that's important, and that brings in the element of magic and brings in the element of improvisation into DBT. That I think improvisation is a very important part of DBT at these moments. Not when everything's going fine. You don't need all of that. But at these moments, you need this. Okay. There are many other possible examples with the constancy of movement, but I'm going to move on because of the constancy of my needing to move on. I want to cover some more things before I get to the end. The next set of principles is that systemic thinking, that going into dialectics is systemic thinking and transactional process. So every element of reality is part of a larger interconnected system. Okay? I'm part of a larger system right now, of many people, of many things, of many contexts, even of this hotel that I'm in right now. And you, my DBT system. Within every element of reality is a smaller world of elements. And to change any one element in a system will change all elements in a system eventually. So it's kind of like everything is interdependent. In Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching in Buddhism, he called that interbeing. Everything is made up of everything else. And everything can be changed by changing everything else. Everything and everyone is connected. This idea of being isolated, just like the idea of standing still, is an illusion. That you are connected, we are connected, one way or another. And if you don't make use of that connection, you convince yourself of the myth that you are totally isolated. But to understand systemic thinking is to seriously widen the scope of evaluation. going to give you a quick example of this because then I want to make sure I get, before we're done, to this protocol I mentioned about a 6-step protocol. Quick intervention. I mean, a quick example. I was treating a family came to see me, 16-year-old boy, a 20-year-old who had been a boy up to then but was transitioning to be a woman, a mother and a father. And the reason they came into therapy with me was because they were having a family, basically, battle. They were in a dead end as a family at that point. Both parents were very upset that their beloved son wanted to transition to be a woman. He had been a very successful boy and adolescent. He was very tall. He was 6 feet 6 inches tall. I don't know what that translates in meters, but that's a very tall person. And the mother was trying to adapt to the young, now by preference, young woman's choices of her pronouns, of a change in her name, and the way of thinking of her. The father could not do that. The father was absolutely angry. He was hurt. You could see it on his face. He articulated in the session that he felt that he was losing his son, that he had spent 20 years with his son and now he was losing him, and it was a terrible loss for him. And he didn't understand it, and he thought it was a terrible idea and it would have a terrible impact on his son's life. And meanwhile, he wouldn't even look at his now transitioning daughter, and she wouldn't look at him. And they're in the session, a complete standoff. The mother was between them, and she couldn't get them to talk to each other, and she couldn't make anything happen. And I couldn't make anything happen. Those of you who've done family therapy know family therapy can sometimes be incredibly difficult, and you get absolutely stuck, and you don't know what to say next. You don't know what to do next. And I came into like session number 3, where we hadn't made any progress as far as I could tell. And I thought about, you know what? I wonder what the 16-year-old brother thinks. And he had been quiet the whole time. So you might say he was the other element of reality outside of the trap, outside of the hell that the father and the new daughter were in. And the mother was also sort of in, and he just sat quietly. He was a very masculine boy who wanted to be a boy. He was actually a football player and a captain on his football team, and he was a very good student, and his father was very proud of him. And I turned to him in that next session, and I said, you know, I haven't heard anything from you about this thing, about your brother deciding to transition to be a woman. What do you think about this whole situation? And this 16-year-old turns to his father, who he's sitting next to his father, turned to his father and said, Dad, I don't get what you're thinking. Like, what is your problem? So what, he wants to be a woman. He said, by the way, Dad, did you not notice ever since he was 5 or 6 years old that he had a lot of characteristics like a girl, and that's one of the things that's wonderful about him? Like, he's making a choice. Why can't you get behind his choice? The father, for the first time, actually seemed to pay attention to somebody. And he turns to him and he said to his 16-year-old, do you really mean that? He said, I really do. I mean that. I don't get why you're so stuck about this. I mean, you're not losing him at all. He's just transforming a little bit into something that he already is. And then that was the beginning of a more open process. It's kind of like, that's because I involved one other member of the system that hadn't yet spoken. And of course, that's what family therapy is often all about, is don't get stuck just trying to treat the identified patient and colluding with the family dynamic, but actually go in a different direction with a different person, trying to change the system. This one is just sort of my own addition, and I'm going to make very short work of it so that I can get on to the next thing. This just says that if, in fact, if you heard what I said today so far, if you get the unity of opposites and the importance of embracing opposition and finding validity in opposition on both sides and hanging in there with that, that's one thing. If you do that, and if you believe in constant movement, that things are always changing, and that speed and movement and flow are important parts of DBT, and if you believe that everything is systemically and transactionally interconnected, so that if you make a move in any one thing, it could change something else, including if you change yourself, you probably will change your patient. If you change yourself, you probably will change your patient. So sometimes you better stop focusing on changing your patient because it's not working and do something different yourself. And then you find that something changes in your patient. Why? Because the two of you are in transaction with each other. If you do those three principles, then you're going to see that this dead end has been an illusion, that things go on, and that the process of dialectics can go on even if you don't yet have an obvious synthesis or solution. Okay. This is just a little diagram I made to capture that if you do ally yourself with synthesis, which is the principle, the unity of opposites, and you ally yourself with connection, which is what I'm using as the term to capture systemic thinking and transactional processes, and flow, which is the term I'm using to capture constant motion, and flexibility, which is the term I'm using that if you believe in the other three things, that you can be more flexible, then it will help you cope with those things that are on the inner circle: opposition, isolation, rigidity, and stagnation. So if you want to get dialectical, it doesn't mean you have to think of one of 9 dialectical strategies. It means you need to try to embrace synthesis, connection, flexibility, and flow. So here's a little protocol to bring that into, and I just highlight here the term improvisation, because I think you have to let magic happen. Sometimes you don't know what's going to come out of your mouth next, and it might be the thing that makes the difference if you've set the stage by believing in these other things. Here's the 6-step process I'm talking about, and this is probably as far as I'm going to get today. Number 1, this is just very practically, this is how I think of it by now. When I'm stuck in a dead-end process in therapy, or what appears to be a dead-end process, number 1, I have to recognize I am stuck, or we are stuck. All right. That's just mindfulness, mindful awareness of stuckness. The next thing I realize that's important is that you might have an urge or an impulse to judge at that point, to strike out, to be defensive, and to be impulsive. You have to block those things if you're going to generate a dialectical process. You have to not go down the road of judging, defending, fighting, being impulsive. You've got to refrain from that and hold steady for a while. And while you do that, what can you do? Locate the opposition within the stuckness. What is it? What truth is opposed to what other truth? Is it your truth versus the patient's truth? Is it one truth inside the patient opposed to another truth inside the patient? I want to live and I want to die. I want to use substances and I want to have a sober life. Whatever it is, try to locate and articulate in your mind, what is opposing what here? Going to a day program, going to a group home versus not going to a group home, going to an apartment versus staying in the hospital, these kind of things. Locate opposition, and then the next step is to validate both sides. And validating both sides is a critical process. It really means you open your mind to not only what you already think and feel, but the other side too. If it's a dialectic where you are caught on one side of the dialectic and then there's another side that's against you, you need to let go of your side, like let go of it. Capital LETGO, really let go. And get into the other side and see the wisdom of the other party, the other position, the other truth. You've got to be able to validate both sides. And if you are in a process of doing that, you are already in a process of facilitating dialectics. And then you pause, because maybe it'll happen in 30 seconds, like it did in the brain of Ed Sheeran in that example I gave you. But maybe it'll take 6 months of being stuck, but validating both sides and not knowing how to get out of it. But you keep validating both sides and you keep trying things. And since you believe in speed, movement, and flow, you keep trying different things. And while you're doing that, you're embracing the concept of opposition and synthesis. You're embracing the concept of speed, movement, and flow. You're thinking systemically. You're operating transactionally. You might be changing yourself in order to change the process. And you apply dialectical strategies which flow out of everything I just said. They just naturally flow out of it. And they're much more effective if they just happen to flow out of it than if you try to use them and impose them in a dead-end situation. And hopefully, at some point, you arrive at synthesis, but already this process in steps 1 through 5 is already a version of synthesis. It's just the process being more important than getting to the correct outcome. Now, I'm going to stop there and just tell you that what I didn't get to, I'll just show you the slides quickly, and then I'll publish it somewhere, or I'll come back and talk again at some point. When I look at dialectical strategies, it helps me to group them into 3 groups. Actually, 5 groups, but 3 that you're familiar with. Those of you who know the 9 strategies, I put 3 of them in as what I call expanding options. I'll just do it quickly. Expanding options means one thing. I'm balancing treatment strategies. I try one strategy, it doesn't work. I try another strategy, it doesn't work. I try a third strategy. I shift from acceptance strategies to change, from change to acceptance. I start to use stylistic strategies, my way of being reciprocal and my way of being irreverent. I go back and forth. In other words, you've got this array of strategies. Dialectical assessment is a similar idea. It's not that you're looking for different strategies, you're looking for different explanations of the problem. Dialectical assessment means you're asking yourself always, what am I leaving out? What am I missing here? And you're expanding your options by doing that. The third thing that's like that is allow natural change, which is you're often bumping up against the frame of the treatment. And maybe sometimes instead of holding the frame steady, you shift. Maybe you add a little time. Maybe you shorten a little time. Maybe you meet them at a different time of day. Maybe you do something else that just allows the pressure to go down. And maybe that'll actually help things. You can try it out. Take your time. Take your time. Use time as an asset. Like maybe it's going to take a while. So calm down, settle down, relax, or change your space, how you use space. I once just turned myself 180 degrees around with a patient that wouldn't speak to me. She wouldn't speak, and she wouldn't speak, and she wouldn't speak in session after session. And she had the look of somebody who was very ashamed. And I tried to do things that would help her with her shame, and nothing was helping her. And I just decided, you know what? I'm going to turn myself around and not face her anymore. I'm going to face the wall. And I did that. And by changing that arrangement, within a few minutes, she started saying things like, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I thought I would look away. I thought maybe we'd have a different kind of conversation if I'm not looking at you." And lo and behold, she starts just talking to me about like normal therapy. So there's another set of strategies I call destabilizing strategies. Enter the paradox is one. Extending is another one of Linehan's. And a third one of Linehan's is devil's advocate. I've got some other ones that are destabilizing strategies. They kind of throw people off, they unbalance the situation. One is called drop the rope, where you just stop pulling against the patient. You just let go as if you're in a tug of war and you just dropped your side and see what happens. Use the element of surprise sometimes. I won't have time to give examples of these, but I just want you to see how I'm thinking. Third set of strategies that include three of Linehan's would be to change perspective. You're looking at the same dead end, but you're looking at it depicted in a metaphor, and you're carrying on the conversation in a metaphor, and that changes everything. You're trying to elicit wise mind, the patient's wise mind, your own wise mind, your collective wise mind. And by even reaching out and saying, gee, I wonder, I'm sorry, I wonder what wise mind thinks. You're already looking at things from a different perspective. When you look at lemonade out of lemons, you're looking for the sort of silver lining in a dark, dead end situation. And that changes perspective. And finally, you can represent the dead end in various expressive modalities, like you can draw art, you could make music, you could use movement. There's just lots of other expressive modalities through which you could change perspective. And finally, flow and connection. Flow is just unrelenting movement. You just keep going. You're an unstoppable force that keeps bouncing up against a dead end, but every time you do it, it's a tiny bit different until something different happens. Systemic interventions, you get the idea already, and transactional processes, you change yourself to change your patient. So that's it that I wanted to cover. And I didn't get every detail in, but I think I got the big picture in, and we have 4 minutes left, Magda. If there's any, I realize I've left almost no time. I'm sorry about that, but I kind of probably tried to do a little too much.
I don't see any. I don't see any negative comments, Charlie, that people are saying that, oh, you're talking too much, or like they
Thank you.
no, absolutely. We have we have more than 60 people with us. So I think this is what we need. And I have write down like several questions, and I received more question from my friends watching you. So I think this is actually a good point probably to finish and to think, and let me officially introduce you for next year,
Okay.
2026, and you may officially agree to continue.
I officially
Because
agree.
great. Because from, my main, like, when I would like to think about in general, it's like you gave us an overview of that great, tremendous difference of like the dialectic when we think about like that we just have to keep in mind both and this and that. How
Mm,
we begin with being dialectical, and you said about the process of bringing dialectic, of process of going or allowing, making condition for synthesis. It's
mm,
I think it's very different, and how you put all this. What I was thinking like this is about what skills, what we need to keep in mind, what we need to keep be oriented for, and now I'm thinking how we do it. If we are very oriented in behavioral model and being more linear, like in our process, it's very difficult to see the movement, the conditions, right? So then I think that to balance it, we need how to keep openness for making condition for dialectics. And
mm.
then I'm thinking that Marsha, she is also a Zen teacher and master. She has all the practice, right? Which many of us, DBT therapists, we're missing. We don't have this part.
Right.
I
Right.
think
It's
this,
true.
I was thinking how important is own practice of dialectical process in daily life for us.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I think, there's a lot of emphasis in people learning mindfulness there's always the question, well, how can I apply mindfulness in daily life? Not in sitting and meditating, but actually going through the day. But I think the same question can be asked about dialectics. If you understand the perspective of dialectics, how do you be dialectical in daily life? What does that look like? And how does that enhance your life? Because I think it does. I think it makes you more improvisational, and I think it makes you more flexible and gives you more openings and helps with your connection to other people. I think dialectics also, like mindfulness, offers an additional openings in your daily practice of life, not just practice of therapy. So that's an unexplored area, I think, for many of us. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes. Thank you very much, Charlie. It was great. And
You're welcome.
we have more than 60 people watching us. And I'm sure for next weeks and months when the webinar will be published, there will be more people, more comment, more questions. And I hope to continue with you. And I'm happy to be there. Looking forward for part 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magda. I really appreciate it.
And please share the webinar with your friends, whoever watching us, to see this part, have some comments, and see you hopefully for part 2 in next year. Thank you and have a good night, everyone.
Bye.